That rusty old car is worth less than the paint on my office wall, the CEO said with a laugh. The crowd laughed with her. Cameras turned. Heads nodded. And for a moment, it seemed like everyone in the showroom had already decided who mattered and who didn't. What none of them knew was that 10 minutes later, not a single person in that room would be laughing. The annual Heritage Motors Collector Showcase drew some of the wealthiest automotive enthusiasts in America. Beneath towering glass ceilings and bright showroom lights, rows of rare classics gleamed like jewels. Restored Corvettes, vintage Mustangs, limited edition Ferraris worth millions of dollars. Everywhere people looked, there was money, status, and prestige. Then there was Ethan Walker. His faded blue pickup rolled quietly into the parking lot just after 9 in the morning. Behind it, attached to a weathered trailer, sat a rusty red Ferrari that looked completely out of place. Its paint was chipped. Its chrome was dull. Small patches of surface rust marked the body like scars earned through decades of survival. Several guests stared before exchanging amused smiles. One man chuckled. Another shook his head. "Why would anybody bring that thing here?" someone whispered. Ethan heard them. He simply kept walking. At 43 years old, he had learned something many people never did. Not every opinion deserved a response. The morning sun reflected off the showroom windows as he carefully lowered the Ferrari from the trailer. His movements were slow and deliberate, respectful, almost protective, as if the car meant far more than anyone could understand. Nearby, his 10-year-old daughter Lily adjusted her baseball cap and smiled up at him. "You think Grandpa would have liked this place?" she asked. Ethan glanced at the Ferrari and smiled softly. "He would have loved it." Lily grinned. "I think he'd be proud." Ethan's eyes lingered on the old car for a second longer. Maybe. Before he could say anything else, a commotion erupted near the entrance. Security stepped aside. Photographers raised cameras. Conversation stopped. Victoria Hayes had arrived, CEO of Hayes Automotive Group, one of the most powerful executives in the industry. She moved through the crowd with effortless confidence, greeting investors and collectors by name. Expensive heels clicked across polished floors. Every eye followed her. Victoria was used to being the center of attention. Then she noticed the Ferrari. She slowed. Her expression shifted. First curiosity, then disbelief, then amusement. "Who brought that?" she asked. Several people pointed toward Ethan. Victoria walked closer. The crowd followed. Ethan remained beside the car, one hand resting lightly on the roof. Victoria studied the vehicle for several seconds before letting out a short laugh. "You actually entered this in the showcase?" A few people nearby laughed immediately. Ethan nodded politely. "I did." Victoria folded her arms. "That car belongs in a scrapyard, not an exhibition." More laughter followed. Some people looked uncomfortable. Others seemed eager to join in. Ethan didn't react. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He simply looked at her and said, "Sometimes things are worth more than they appear." Victoria smiled as though she had just heard a child tell a fairy tale. "Trust me," she replied. "I know cars." Around them, the showroom lights reflected across millions of dollars in polished metal and glass. Yet somehow, all attention remained fixed on one rusty Ferrari and one quiet single father who refused to be embarrassed. And somewhere beneath that faded hood, hidden from every eye in the room, waited a secret capable of changing everything. The laughter did not follow Ethan for very long. Most people quickly returned to admiring polished showpieces worth fortunes, but a few continued glancing toward the old Ferrari as though it were some strange exhibit that had wandered into the wrong building. Ethan seemed not to notice. He crouched beside the front wheel and gently wiped away a small layer of dust with a clean microfiber cloth. Lily stood nearby holding a bottle of detailing spray almost as carefully as someone might carry a family heirloom. "Dad?" she asked quietly. "Does it bother you when people say things like that?" Ethan tightened the cap on the cloth container before looking up. "Not really." Lily tilted her head. "Not even a little?" He smiled. "People can only judge what they see." She thought about that for a moment. "And they cannot see everything?" "Most of the time," Ethan said. "They do not even know where to look." Lily nodded slowly. It was an answer she had heard before. Over the years, her father had spoken those words in different ways, usually whenever life became difficult. The showcase buzzed with activity around them. Wealthy collectors discussed auction prices. Investors exchanged business cards. Journalists moved from display to display searching for stories. Yet Ethan remained completely focused on the old car. To him, it was not an investment. It was not a collectible. It was family. Nearly 15 years earlier, Ethan had never imagined his life would look like this. Back then, he worked long hours restoring vintage automobiles with his father, Richard Walker, inside a small garage outside Lexington, Kentucky. The building smelled of motor oil, pine shelves, and fresh coffee. It was never fancy. It never needed to be. Richard believed that character mattered more than appearances. He often told Ethan, "The world notices shiny things first. The smart people look deeper." At the time, Ethan had not fully understood. Years later, after losing both his father and his wife within a short span of time, those words became something he carried every day. Raising Lily alone had changed him. It taught him patience. It taught him humility. It taught him that some of the most valuable things in life never appeared valuable from the outside. A sudden voice interrupted his thoughts. Still cleaning it. Ethan looked up. An older man wearing a collector badge stood nearby. His gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his eyes showed curiosity rather than judgment. "Trying to," Ethan replied. The man studied the Ferrari. "Interesting machine." Ethan smiled politely. "I think so." The man walked slowly around the vehicle. "Most people would have sold it years ago." Lily answered before Ethan could. "We never would." The man smiled. "No." She shook her head firmly. "Grandpa trusted us with it." Something softened in the stranger's expression. "That is a good reason." As he walked away, Lily looked toward her father. "Do you think Grandpa knew everyone would laugh at it someday?" Ethan glanced at the faded red paint reflecting the bright showroom lights. For a moment, he almost heard his father's voice again. Calm. Certain. Unshaken by opinions. "Maybe," Ethan said, and I think he would have laughed right back. Lily giggled. The sound was warm and genuine. Across the showroom floor, Victoria Hayes noticed them from a distance. She had expected embarrassment. She had expected frustration. Instead, she saw a father and daughter smiling beside a car that should have been making them miserable. For reasons she could not explain, that bothered her more than if Ethan had argued. Because confident people were easy to understand. Angry people were easy to understand. But quiet people who had nothing to prove often carried secrets no one expected. Victoria Hayes had spent her entire career learning how to measure value. Balance sheets, market projections, acquisitions. Every major decision came down to numbers. Yet as she stood on the second-floor balcony overlooking the showcase floor, she found herself watching something that made no sense at all. Ethan Walker was not acting like a man who owned a worthless car. More importantly, he was not acting like a man who wanted attention. That detail stayed with her. Most collectors chased recognition. They bragged about rare parts, celebrity ownership histories, and auction prices. Ethan did none of those things. He simply stayed beside the car, talking with Lily and occasionally answering questions from curious visitors. Victoria frowned. Something about that bothered her. She descended the staircase and crossed the showroom floor. Several investors attempted to stop her for conversations, but she politely excused herself. Her attention remained fixed on Ethan. When she finally reached him, Lily was sitting in a folding chair sketching the Ferrari in a small notebook. Ethan stood nearby holding a bottle of water. Victoria folded her arms. "I have a question." Ethan looked up calmly. "All right. Why bring it here?" she asked. "You knew people would judge it." Ethan smiled faintly. "Maybe. Then why?" He glanced at the car before answering. "Because some things deserve to be seen." Victoria studied him carefully. "Even when they look unfinished?" "Especially then." For a moment she had no response. Around them, the steady hum of conversation filled the building. Glass display cases reflected rows of polished automobiles worth more than most houses. Yet somehow the simple answer lingered in her thoughts. Lily suddenly looked up from her sketchbook. "My grandpa used to say that." Victoria turned toward her. "He did." Lily nodded. "He always said beautiful things do not need permission to be beautiful." Ethan laughed softly. "He said a lot of things. Most of them weird," Lily replied. Ethan chuckled again. Victoria noticed something unexpected then. Neither of them spoke about money. Not once. The realization felt strangely refreshing. Before she could stop herself, she asked another question. "How much would it take?" Ethan looked confused. "How much for what?" "The car." Lily immediately lowered her pencil. Ethan remained calm. "It is not for sale." Victoria smiled slightly. Everything is for sale. Not everything. Name a number. No, she blinked. No. No. The answer arrived without hesitation, without negotiation, without interest. Several nearby collectors began listening. Victoria noticed them gathering, but continued anyway. You have not even heard an offer. Ethan took a slow sip of water. I do not need to. What if it is life-changing money? Ethan glanced toward Lily. The little girl had returned to her drawing, completely unconcerned about the conversation. A warmth entered his expression. I already have the important things. For the second time that morning, Victoria found herself without a prepared response. Ethan was not trying to impress her. He was not trying to win an argument. He simply believed what he was saying. That certainty was difficult to challenge. As she prepared to walk away, Lily suddenly spoke again. Dad, yeah. Do you think Grandpa knew this day would happen? Ethan looked at the Ferrari. Sunlight streamed through the massive showroom windows and settled across the faded paint. For a brief second, the old machine seemed almost alive. I think, Ethan said quietly. He knew people would underestimate it. Lily smiled. Then we are right on schedule. A few nearby listeners laughed warmly. Even Ethan laughed. Victoria did not. Because for reasons she could not explain, she had begun to suspect that the father and daughter standing beside that aging Ferrari knew something everyone else in the building did not. The afternoon crowd continued to grow. Word had begun spreading across the showcase floor about the unusual father who refused every offer and the aging Ferrari that somehow seemed to attract more attention than vehicles worth 20 times as much. People gathered in small circles, sharing theories and opinions. Most assumed Ethan was stubborn. Some assumed he was foolish. A few believed he was hiding something. Victoria Hay stood near a display of modern supercars, listening to fragments of conversation she normally would have ignored. Maybe he thinks it is worth a fortune. Maybe he inherited it. Maybe he just likes attention. The last comment made her glance across the room. Ethan was helping Lily adjust a loose strap on her backpack. Neither of them appeared interested in the attention at all. That contradiction continued to bother her. One of her senior executives approached carrying a tablet. Victoria, the investors from Dallas are ready whenever you are. She nodded. Give me 10 minutes. The executive looked surprised. 10. He walked away. Victoria returned her attention to Ethan. She was not accustomed to unanswered questions. Throughout her career, every mystery eventually revealed itself. Every negotiation had a pressure point. Every person had a price. Yet Ethan Walker seemed immune to all three. Meanwhile, Lily sat beside the Ferrari sketching quietly. Her drawing had become surprisingly detailed. Every curve of the body, every scratch, every imperfection. She even included the rust spots. An older woman passing by stopped to look. That is beautiful, she said. Lily smiled. Thank you. Most children would draw the shiny cars. Lily shrugged. This one tells a better story. The woman chuckled softly before moving on. Ethan overheard the exchange and smiled. His father used to say something similar. The best stories were rarely polished. They were earned. Across the showroom, a large digital screen suddenly lit up. The announcer's voice echoed through the building. Ladies and gentlemen, in 1 hour we will begin the collector's choice evaluation. Independent experts will review selected vehicles from today's exhibition. A wave of excitement swept through the crowd. Collectors immediately began preparing their cars. Cameras appeared. Reporters moved into position. Victoria's eyes narrowed slightly. An idea was beginning to form. She crossed the floor again until she reached Ethan. There is an expert evaluation starting soon, she said. Ethan nodded. I heard. Enter the car. It is already registered. Victoria seemed surprised. You planned that? Of course. Even after everyone laughed. Ethan smiled. People are allowed to laugh. The answer irritated her more than it should have. You really believe they will see something special? I do. Based on what? Ethan rested his hand lightly against the roof of the Ferrari. His expression remained calm. Trust. Victoria folded her arms. Trust is not evidence. No, Ethan agreed. But sometimes it is enough to keep going until the evidence arrives. For several seconds neither spoke. Around them, conversations blended into a steady hum beneath the bright showroom lights. The scent of polished leather and fresh coffee drifted through the air. Somewhere nearby, a vintage engine started and drew applause. Yet Victoria barely noticed any of it. Because for the first time all day, She found herself wondering whether she wanted Ethan to be wrong or whether she was beginning to hope he was right. And deep inside the crowded showroom, the anticipation was building toward a moment none of them would forget. The final hour before the evaluation felt different. Conversations became quieter. Collectors straightened display signs. Reporters checked cameras. Judges moved between rows of vehicles carrying clipboards and tablets. The energy inside the showcase shifted from celebration to anticipation. Near the center of the hall, Ethan and Lily remained beside the Ferrari. Neither appeared nervous. Lily continued sketching while Ethan wiped a small section of glass near the driver's side window. Across the room, Victoria Hayes watched them again. She had attended dozens of collector events over the years. She knew how owners behaved when judges approached. They rehearsed speeches. They highlighted awards. They advertised rarity. Ethan did none of those things. That alone made him impossible to ignore. A voice echoed through the sound system. Ladies and gentlemen, the collector's choice evaluation will now begin. Applause rolled through the showroom. The first vehicles were examined one by one. Owners eagerly explained restoration histories and documented provenance. Judges nodded politely and moved on. 30 minutes later, a small crowd had formed around Ethan's display. Some were curious. Some were skeptical. Others simply wanted to see what happened next. Victoria stepped forward until she stood only a few feet away. "This is your chance," she said quietly. Ethan looked up. "For what?" "To find out whether your confidence is justified." Ethan smiled faintly. "I never said I was confident." Victoria frowned. "You seem confident." "No," Ethan replied. "I am grateful. There is a difference." Before she could answer, 3 judges approached the display. The lead evaluator was a respected automotive historian named Charles Whitmore. His reputation carried weight throughout the collector community. When Charles spoke, people listened. He adjusted his glasses and reviewed the registration paperwork. "Ethan Walker? That is me." Charles nodded. "Interesting entry." Several people in the crowd chuckled. Charles ignored them. He slowly walked around the Ferrari. His eyes examined every panel, every contour, every imperfection. Unlike the others, he was not looking for reasons to dismiss it. He was looking for answers. Minutes passed. The crowd grew larger. Silence gradually replaced conversation. Even Victoria noticed the change. Charles stopped near the front of the vehicle and crouched slightly. His expression became more focused. Then he stood and looked directly at Ethan. "May we inspect the engine compartment?" Ethan glanced at Lily. She smiled and nodded. "Of course." A faint ripple moved through the audience. Phones appeared. Cameras lifted. Reporters stepped closer. Victoria folded her arms and waited. Somewhere in the back of the crowd, a man whispered, "This should be interesting." Another replied, "Maybe we will finally learn what he thinks is so special." Ethan reached into his pocket and removed a small key. For a brief moment, he simply held it. The bright showroom lights reflected across the worn metal. Lily looked up from her chair. There was excitement in her eyes, but also something deeper. Trust. The same trust Ethan had spoken about earlier. He walked to the front of the Ferrari and placed his hand on the hood. The room seemed quieter now. Even the distant conversations had faded. Charles stepped closer. Victoria watched carefully. Dozens of people leaned forward. Ethan released the latch. A soft metallic click echoed through the stillness. Then, with calm and deliberate movements, he began lifting the hood while every eye in the showroom followed. The hood rose slowly until it locked into place. For a second, nobody spoke. The crowd expected to see an ordinary engine buried beneath years of age and neglect. Instead, dozens of faces leaned closer. Charles Whitmore stepped forward first. His practiced eyes moved carefully across every component. He did not rush. He did not speculate. He simply observed. Victoria stood only a few feet away now. Her attention never left the engine bay. Around them, cameras remained raised. The bright showroom lights reflected off aged metal and polished mechanical surfaces that had clearly been maintained with extraordinary care. Ethan said nothing. Lily stood quietly beside him. Charles adjusted his glasses. Then he leaned closer. Much closer. His expression changed almost immediately. The confidence of a seasoned evaluator gave way to something else. Curiosity. Surprise. Then disbelief. One of the other judges noticed the shift. "Charles." No answer. Charles continued staring. The second judge stepped forward. "What is it?" Still no answer. A murmur spread through the crowd. Victoria narrowed her eyes. "What does he see?" she asked quietly. Charles slowly reached into his pocket and removed a small flashlight. The beam swept across a section of the engine block. He froze. Completely froze. The crowd sensed it instantly. Conversation stopped. The room became strangely still. Even distant sounds from the far side of the exhibition hall seemed to disappear. Charles swallowed hard. That cannot be right. One of the judges frowned. What cannot be right? Charles pointed toward a small area near the center of the engine. Look. Both judges leaned forward. Seconds later, they reacted exactly the same way. Silence. Absolute silence. Victoria stepped closer. What are you looking at? Charles slowly stood upright. His face had lost all color. For nearly 20 years, he had evaluated some of the rarest automobiles in the world. He was not a man easily shocked. Yet his hands trembled slightly. "Miss Hayes," he said quietly, "you should see this yourself." Victoria approached the vehicle. The crowd parted immediately. She leaned into the engine compartment and followed the direction of Charles's flashlight. At first she saw only metal. Then she saw it. A signature. Small. Precise. Handwritten directly onto a component protected deep within the engine assembly. For several seconds, she simply stared. Her expression did not change because her mind had not yet caught up with what her eyes were seeing. Then reality arrived all at once. She stepped back. No, Charles nodded slowly. Yes. Nobody laughed now. Nobody whispered. The silence felt almost sacred. One of the judges finally spoke. Is it authentic? Charles looked back at the engine. If it is not, then someone created the most convincing forgery I have ever seen. Victoria stared at Ethan. The calm father standing beside his daughter looked exactly the same as he had an hour earlier. No pride. No triumph. No arrogance. Just quiet dignity. You knew, she said softly. Ethan glanced toward the signature before looking back at her. My father told me it was there. And you never told anyone? Most people never asked. Another wave of silence moved through the crowd. Somewhere near the back, a reporter lowered his camera. Another collector removed his hat. Charles looked at Ethan with a level of respect that had not existed before. Then he looked back at the engine one more time and spoke the words that changed the atmosphere of the entire showcase. Ladies and gentlemen, I believe we may be looking at a piece of automotive history that was never supposed to leave the shadows. No one moved for several seconds after Charles Whitmore spoke. The words seemed to hang in the air above the crowd like something too important to rush past. A piece of automotive history, never supposed to leave the shadows. Reporters exchanged stunned looks. Collectors leaned closer. Even the judges appeared unsure what to say next. Victoria Hayes looked from the engine to Ethan and back again. The certainty she had carried all morning was gone. In its place was a question she could no longer ignore. How did your family get this car? She asked quietly. Ethan rested one hand on the edge of the open hood. For the first time all day, his expression grew thoughtful. Not defensive, not proud, just reflective. My father never talked about it much, he said. He believed some stories mattered more than recognition. The crowd listened carefully. Nobody interrupted. Ethan continued. When I was a boy, I used to help him in our garage after school. One evening I asked why he spent so much time working on this car. He told me it was because promises require maintenance. Several people exchanged confused glances. Lily smiled. She had heard the story before. What did he mean? Victoria asked. Ethan looked at the Ferrari. Years ago, my father worked with a private restoration group that handled rare European vehicles. One project connected him with people who had direct ties to Ferrari's early history. The details were never fully explained to me. He only said that this particular vehicle carried a responsibility. Charles nodded slowly. That would explain a great deal. Ethan continued. Before he passed away, he handed me the keys and told me something I never forgot. The room remained silent. He said, do not measure this car by what someone will pay for it. Measure it by what it teaches you about character. Victoria lowered her eyes. Those words landed harder than she expected. Ethan smiled faintly. At the time, I thought he was talking about the car. And now? Charles asked. Ethan glanced toward Lily. Now I know he was talking about people. Another silence settled across the showroom. This one felt different. Warmer. More personal. Nearby, Lily carefully closed her sketchbook and stepped closer to her father. Grandpa always said the car was never the treasure. Ethan nodded. That is right. Victoria looked at the little girl. Then what was? Lily answered without hesitation. The story. Several people smiled. One reporter quietly lowered her camera. Another collector removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. The atmosphere inside the building had changed completely. Earlier, people had gathered because they expected entertainment. Now they listened because they felt respect. Charles turned back toward the engine. There is something else, he said. The crowd immediately focused on him. If this signature is authentic, and I believe it is, then the historical significance may be extraordinary. Excitement flickered through the room again. Yet Ethan seemed almost unaffected. Victoria noticed that. You are not curious what it might be worth? She asked. Ethan laughed softly. Everybody keeps asking me that. Because it matters. Maybe. He looked around the showroom filled with wealth, status, and prestige. Then he placed a hand gently on Lily's shoulder. But some things are valuable long before anyone assigns a number to them. For the third time that day, Victoria Hayes found herself unable to argue. And as the crowd stood in thoughtful silence around the aging Ferrari, many of them began realizing the same thing. The most remarkable thing in the room might not have been hidden inside the engine at all. The excitement surrounding the discovery continued spreading through the showcase like a rising tide. Reporters began making calls. Collectors exchanged business cards. Several museum representatives quietly appeared near the display. What had started as a curiosity was becoming the center of the entire event. Yet Ethan Walker remained exactly where he had been all day, standing beside Lily with the same calm expression that had confused so many people. Charles Whitmore spent nearly 20 minutes reviewing photographs and historical notes with the other judges. When he finally returned, his face carried a seriousness that immediately captured everyone's attention. Mr. Walker, he said, there is more. The crowd fell silent again. Charles held a folder in his hands. The signature alone is remarkable, but we found something in the documentation attached to your registration photographs. Ethan looked surprised. What kind of something? Charles opened the folder carefully, a detail most people would have missed. He turned a page toward the judges. Several of them nodded. One removed his glasses and stared at the image a second time. Victoria stepped closer. What is it? Charles looked at Ethan before answering. Your father was not simply preserving this vehicle. He paused. He was completing a promise. The words landed softly but carried enormous weight. Ethan's expression changed. For the first time all day, emotion appeared in his eyes. Charles continued. We contacted an archive in Italy. The records suggest this vehicle was connected to a small experimental project that was never fully documented. The individuals involved believed portions of its history would eventually disappear. He held up an old photograph that had been transmitted digitally only moments earlier. The image showed several men standing beside an unfinished vehicle decades ago. One of them was pointing toward the engine compartment. Another was smiling. Your father spent years helping preserve records tied to this project, Charles said. Not for money, not for recognition, simply because he believed history mattered. Ethan stared at the photograph. Lily gently slipped her hand into his. Dad? She asked softly. He swallowed before answering. That sounds like him. The room remained completely still. Charles closed the folder. Based on everything we have seen today, I do not believe your father was protecting a machine. He glanced toward Lily. I believe he was protecting a story so future generations would remember it. Lily smiled through shining eyes. That is exactly what Grandpa would have wanted. Nearby, Victoria lowered her gaze. Earlier that morning she had laughed at the car. Now she felt something entirely different. Respect. Not for the vehicle itself, but for the family standing beside it. She stepped forward slowly. Ethan. He looked at her. The crowd watched carefully. I owe you an apology. Ethan said nothing. Victoria took a breath. I judged you before I knew anything about you. I looked at appearances and assumed I understood the truth. The room remained silent. I was wrong. Ethan studied her for a moment before offering a small smile. That happens to all of us sometimes. No accusation. No victory. No bitterness. Just grace. Victoria felt the weight of that kindness more than any criticism. Around them, the crowd seemed to understand it too. Because in a building filled with wealth, influence, and prestige, the most valuable thing anyone witnessed that day was not hidden beneath the hood of an old Ferrari. It was the quiet dignity of a man who never needed the world to recognize his worth in order to know it himself. The showcase officially ended an hour later, but very few people seemed interested in leaving. Small groups still gathered around Ethan and Lily, not asking about prices anymore, but asking about Richard Walker, about the old garage in Kentucky, and about the lessons that had survived far longer than any machine. The atmosphere felt different now, softer, more human. The judges completed their final evaluations and announced special recognitions. When Charles Whitmore stepped onto the small presentation stage, the room immediately quieted. "Today," he said, "we came here expecting to celebrate remarkable automobiles. Instead, we were reminded why preserving history matters in the first place." Applause filled the showroom. Charles looked toward Ethan. "Some treasures cannot be measured in dollars. Some stories cannot be replaced. And some people remind us what dignity looks like when no one is watching." The applause grew louder. Ethan lowered his head slightly, uncomfortable with the attention. Lily grinned proudly beside him. Victoria Hayes joined the applause as well. There was no hesitation this time. No pride standing in the way. Only respect. After the ceremony ended, museum representatives approached Ethan with proposals. Collectors offered introductions. Journalists requested interviews. One executive quietly suggested an amount that would have purchased several houses. Ethan listened politely and thanked each person. Then he declined every offer. "You are really turning all of them down?" Victoria asked as the crowd slowly dispersed. Ethan smiled. "I told you earlier. It is not for sale." Victoria shook her head with a laugh. "I believe you now." For a moment neither spoke. Sunlight from the western windows stretched long golden reflections across the showroom floor. Workers were already beginning to pack equipment. The excitement of the day was fading into memory. Victoria looked at the Ferrari one last time. "You know," she said, "this morning I thought that car was the most interesting thing about you." Ethan chuckled softly. "And now?" She glanced toward Lily. "Now I think it might be the least interesting thing." Ethan laughed. So did Lily. It was the first completely relaxed moment they had shared all day. As evening settled outside, Ethan carefully lowered the hood and secured the latch. The sound seemed to mark the end of something important. Not the end of a story. The end of a misunderstanding. Lily climbed into the passenger seat and fastened her seat belt. "Dad, yeah. Do you think Grandpa would have liked today?" Ethan paused before answering. Through the windshield, he could see the fading sunlight turning the sky shades of gold and amber. He could almost picture his father standing in the old garage, coffee cup in hand, smiling that quiet smile that never needed attention. "I think he would have liked what people learned today," Ethan said. Lily nodded. "Me too." The engine started with a deep, confident rumble. Conversations nearby stopped. Several people turned to listen, not because of the machine itself, but because they now understood what it represented. Ethan waved goodbye to Charles. Then to Victoria. She returned the gesture with a genuine smile. The Ferrari rolled slowly toward the exit. No cameras followed. No reporters rushed behind it. Nobody shouted. The crowd simply watched. And as the father and daughter disappeared into the evening light, a peaceful silence settled over the showroom. It was the kind of silence that arrives when people finally understand something important. Because sometimes the rarest thing in the world is not hidden beneath the hood of a famous car. Sometimes it is found inside an ordinary person who chooses character over recognition, grace over pride, and love over everything else.